Welcome to our community lecture series called Building a Belonging. These mini-series are a collection of concepts and social challenges with which there are opportunities for engagement, building belonging, and practicing theology as liberation. This series centers gender and sexuality and relating as theological and social imperatives. We hope that this training serves as a primer for the complex and interconnected discourse on scientific and theological identities. As a subscriber, we hope that you've had time to look through our Building Belonging resource material, which is always free, in-depth, and focused on independent self-guided formation surrounding concepts that concern the church and are typically left out of conversation. Please be sure to visit the YouTube page and subscribe for more Building Belonging lecture series to come. The series we've created for gender, sexuality, and relating comes with the following objectives that we are sure you will feel comfortable with by the end of our time together. Directly following this slide, there will be a pre-lecture survey you will need to submit for CEs or credit through our agency. Those surveys not only help us guide our content, but they also provide invaluable feedback about where Building Belonging should focus in our growing library of content. There will be a pre and post survey, and both will take less than 3 minutes for you to complete. As always, we appreciate your feedback, and you are necessary for our work. The main objectives on this series are to understand the universal yet deeply individual experience of sexual orientation and its dimensions, to further understand the complex components that make up all people's experience of sex, gender, and expression, to understand the use of and the importance of gender-affirming care for all people, to integrate new dimensions of sexuality and gender into the self and to our perceptions of others. Additionally, we hope for you to integrate tools of liberation into personal and public theological discourse, practice the use of resisting oppressive theological stances in your personal and public discourse, and lastly, to create meaningful steps in personal and professional roles that incorporate science and theology, that celebrates the expansiveness of each individual's unique identity. Please take a moment now, if you can, to complete the pre-workshop survey that is listed here, and you will also find within your free library of resources and linked to the session on our YouTube channel. So here's our roadmap when we are discussing building a belonging and speaking about sexual orientation, relating, and gender. One, we're always going to start out with defining belonging and how belonging works in all of our lives. The second is to talk about sexual, affectional, and relational experiences that we call sexual orientation. And then we'll move into a discussion on gender, sex, identity, and expression. From there, we'll move into gender affirmation and building solidarity through the universal understanding of what gender affirming care and gender affirmation really are. And we're going to follow that in our series with our last topics, which are theological tools. First, the theological tools of oppression and how historically people who are LGBTQ, BIPOC, immigrant, or otherwise marginalized have been erased from our conversations about spirituality and theology. And then we'll end and close with theological tools of belonging, ways in which we can create an expansiveness in our understanding of what is sacred and what is divine, and how to incorporate the needs and the experiences of those living on the margins. To be is to belong to someone. Here in our Building Belonging series, we will always incorporate facilitator truths. And for this particular series, here are the facilitator truths. We hope you will interrogate these with your own personal understandings and embed them within the conversations that you may have after this around building belonging and sexual orientation and gender. We believe that belonging is a birthright to all, and that if we are made in the divine image, then all people being known is the way toward the sacred. We believe that faith and scripture have been used as tools of oppression and can be used to inspire liberation. We also hold true that any uninterrogated bias is a betrayal of our potential interconnectedness. We also believe that it is our duty to use radical welcome and steadfast solidarity, knowing that all oppression is connected. So why do we start with belonging? We know that feeling of belonging to self, to others, and to the spiritual, and also to the existential reality that belonging is a need of everyone. We begin each session at belonging because this is our paramount interest in these projects we've designed. Within all people, it is possible to see ourselves. Within all experiences of belonging or isolation, we can find compassion and motivation to include more of us. So let us begin with defining belonging. In a personal sense, the feeling of belonging is being known and necessary. It's the experience of feeling valued and influential within the spaces that you live, work, and play. Socially, belonging is the experience of being included, wanted, desired, and connected to others across multiple areas of life, and not just when we are useful or we are put together. That understanding of social belonging also includes our messiness and our wholeness, our fears and our vulnerabilities, our challenges, and the wins that we have in life. Spiritual belonging includes a set of theologies that incorporate and celebrate the complex and dynamic human experience, that we are all equally sacred and reflective of the divine. Thinking spiritually about belonging is thinking about the ways that we all are on purpose and have been since before we arrived. Existential belonging, then, is the felt sense of being known, of being inherently good, being held, and being a meaning-making agent who requires no constriction of identity. These are all ways that we can and hopefully will experience belonging within our lives. And all of these, in a certain degree, have something to do with how we are seen and who we know ourselves to be, which is the topic of this Building Belonging series on sexual orientation and gender. Much like all of our Building Belonging content, we hope that you will listen in, take notes, recall and remember your own personal experiences, and allow the content to resonate with your own life, because all of these social challenges that we've developed projects for have touched our lives, our families, our congregations, our organizations in some way, or they will. So please find a comfortable space, whether you are alone or in community for this series, and bring to center your experiences of being you. As we begin, I want to now introduce you to components of sexual, affectional, relational experience. These are the kinds of components that we call in our custom and culture sexual orientation. And really, what sexual orientation is, by definition, is a way to describe who we love, how we love, and the frequency and intensity of that love. And what that does inversely is it has a conversation about what it means for our social belonging. Now, as we start to discuss sexuality, one of the most key components to this series is that when we talk about sexuality, romance, affection, and relating to others, a common misconception is that we are only talking about LGBTQ people. And this is a mystery in my mind as to why this is the case, because every single one of us has a pattern of human relating to others that includes some of these very important spectra. And so my introduction to sexuality in and of itself is that even within your own relationship that you have now, or maybe you've had in the past, there are these spectra that live and exist within your sexuality, regardless of who you are attracted to, that have a uniqueness about them because of who you are individually, but also have a universality in which we can talk about the experience of sexual orientation. And so the first part of our spectra of sexuality is sexual attraction. And for this particular slide, I want us all to kind of experience this the same way. There are arrows pointing up and there are arrows pointing down, nearly as if each of these 4 spectra are a thermometer or a temperature gauge. Let's all consider the bottom portion of these arrows that are pointing down as 0, and the top, let's call those 100 for now. So when we talk about sexual attraction and we talk about the 100 or the top part of the arrow, the definition of this kind of 100 being sexual attraction is allosexuality, which means a person who often experiences sexual attraction or the feeling of wanting to have sex and intimacy with a specific person. The middle being a gray space, kind of this in-between space where sexual attraction doesn't occur often, but it does happen. And then the bottom arrow, this one denoting the exact opposite in this case of allosexuality, which is asexuality, meaning that there aren't those lived in your body experiences of sexual attraction to a specific person. Now, this is a rudimentary and very basic gauge on what sexual attraction means in and of itself, but please note that it is a spectrum and that sexual attraction itself can change over time as we change as people. Next, we have libido. And so when we think about libido, we're going to use the same kind of criteria for the thermometer, 0 being low libido down at the bottom, and 100 being high libido at the top. High libido, what it really refers to is the strong experience in the body of having a sex drive. Whether or not that is directed towards a specific person doesn't really matter. It means as a person who lives in a body and has specific impulses for sex and intimacy and relating, does it happen often or does it happen less frequently? At the bottom of the spectrum of libido, you'll see low libido, meaning that the impulse or sex drive of the person is lower or maybe rarely occurs. And these are, again, things that change and fluctuate, and I'll move through that topic and make some nuances in our next slide. Next, we have sex favorability. Sex favorability is something that is rarely discussed, but I think it's a really important concept to bring into the fold when we're talking about sexual orientation as a universal experience. So again, if the bottom or the arrow pointing down is 0 and the top and the arrow pointing up is 100, we have a really long and large gauge. So sex favorable at 100 means that sex is appealing and it is enjoyable, and pleasure in and of itself is something that a person does entertain and wants to entertain. Sex indifference, which is somewhere right in the middle, means that we don't maybe have an inherent like or dislike of sex. It's a part of life, but it isn't something that gives us favorability or repulsion. Sex aversity, which is close to the bottom, if you'll see, means it's hard to like sex. It's hard to feel that it is appealing or pleasing. And at the bottom, what we have designated as 0 is sex repulsion, finding the idea of bodies and human desires disgusting, gross, or repulsive. And so this is just one spectra that does change and can change over life, can also change based on context and human experience. And again, as we consider these spectra, I really hope that we will all understand that these are fluid and they are not fixed. They are not monoliths within even our own personal experiences. Lastly is sex positivity. And sex positivity is one of the only spectra of sexuality that is compromised of also cultural stigmas and taboos and the conditioning that we have within our families and within society. And so these are things that create either permission and pleasure or can potentially feel like conversations about sex have a lot of shame or guilt. So at the top, at the 100, is sex positive, believing that sex is good, that people can do what they want with their bodies, and understanding that sex in and of itself creates intimacy and attachment and decreases negative mental health symptoms like anxiety and depression. Sex neutrality in the middle means maybe that you are in a social conditioning where sex may not have been directly positive, but also it did not have any negative connotations either. And sex negative, down at the bottom, is believing that sex is bad or sex should be restricted. And I think farther down the spectrum of sex positivity, the more negative a person's understanding of sex to be, I think the more inherent guilt or shame or feelings of vulnerability and embarrassment about conversations regarding sex can be. And so thinking about this more as an ideology than a function of how we relate to our own sexuality is important. Because when we understand this as an ideology, it's something that is more malleable for us to deconstruct or re-narrate within our own minds. So because of the nature of copyright and this video being on YouTube, there is an embedded video for you to use here as a reference tool. And I'm going to be giving you some highlights from the video and then pairing it with information we've already covered to give you a synthesized version of this material. This video reviews some basic sexual orientation identities and how to understand the terms and what those mean about a person's relationship or relating styles. So on the next slide, we'll nuance out certain definitions and rework how we understand all human sexual orientation. So when we think about sexual orientation, typically within the society in which I live, which is a white, European-centric, Christian-focused nation, we think about orientation terms that are very rigid and they are fixed and they are only in discussion with the types of people that we are attracted to. And so this slide really speaks to the heart of the fact that definitions about sexual orientation are not exclusionary to the LGBTQ community. In fact, there are ways that we can better describe our sexual orientation and our patterns of relating, even in long-term straight marriages that have been around and you have been supporting for years. And so on the left-hand side of the screen, I want to talk about preference-based examples and definitions. Preference-based definitions are sexual orientation terms that help communicate to other people the type of people that we are attracted to. So when we say preference-based, some examples of that are saying that you are a person who is straight. Straight has a connotation socially, meaning that you are a person of one gender who is attracted to and has sex with people of the opposite gender. Same thing as it relates to the term gay. Gay means that you are a person of a gender who loves people of the same gender. More specifically is the term lesbian, meaning a woman who loves women. Queer being more ambiguous, and I think maybe a little bit broader in its permission, as a definition of a person who does not subscribe to maybe the social conditions of who they sleep with, right? And so this can mean that maybe your gender itself is not fixed into the category of male or female, and neither are the types of bodies that you are attracted to. Same gender loving is a culturally confined definition for Black men who love Black men. And pansexuality is a definition or a term that talks about preference that is not beholden to genitalia. So thinking about the idea of someone who is open to falling in love with or intimately relating or having sex with someone regardless of their gender is what we're talking about here. On the right-hand side, however, there are expression-based definitions, and these are sexual orientation terms that help us to communicate how we are attracted to the people that we feel attraction to, regardless of their gender. So what I mean by that is a person who considers themselves to be straight could also consider themselves to be aromantic or asexual. And so I'll walk you through these definitions, but just know that these are really talking about the how of how we have sex and how we relate to people, and not who it is that we are attracted to. And so aromantic, as it suggests with that A in the front as a Latin prefix, means none, meaning a person, regardless of who it is that they are attracted to, may feel little or no experience of romance, of that kind of like relational intimacy. Not meaning that they do not have sex, not meaning that they do not perform some sort of intimacy with their partners, but just that that particular experience of romance is not something that they experience or express as often as maybe we have socially constructed. Asexual, again, with the Latin prefix of a, meaning none, meaning a person who does not experience any or often experience sexual attraction or the want to have sex with other people. So thinking about that not being beholden to the type of people that you're having sex with, but just overall your relationship to the desire to have sex. Omnisexuality, meaning any and all, right? Omni being every. Thinking about this idea that my expression, so to speak, in this, I'll give this kind of case example. My expression of sexuality includes multiple ways of relating to people across potentially multiple genders of people. Demisexuality, meaning that regardless of the gender of the people that I am excited about having sex with or feel a sense of sexual attraction to, I need to have an emotional connection to that person first. I think a lot of people, regardless of whether you are straight, lesbian, queer, gay, have that understanding that in their experience of sex and sexual attraction, emotions and emotional connection or maybe vulnerability need to be occurring, kind of co-occurring, in order for that sex to be fulfilling. Other expression-based terminology is how many people we love, right? So thinking about this idea that I could be a straight person who has romantic experiences across multiple genders, and maybe I'm polyamorous, meaning that I have sex with or have multiple romantic and intimate relationships with other people. Monogamy being the inverse, meaning that my sexual and intimate and even potentially romantic responses to people are limited to one person at a time. Hopefully these orientations, as we kind of trouble them out to be preference-based and expression-based, help to see that we have a lot more in common when it comes to explaining how it is that we love others, regardless of whether who we love is different. Now it's time to talk about gender, sex, and identity. And I think one of the things that is most important is that we understand how complicated gender, sex, and identity truly are, regardless of how we feel about our gender and who we know ourselves to be. So gender, sex, and identity are comprised of who the medical community says that we are, what norms we hold on to or deviate from, how we know who we are to ourselves, and where these identities create belonging or isolation. And so some of these are going to be very intimate conversations that we have within ourselves. Some of these are going to be how society converses with who they think that we are. And some of this is about whether or not we can make a congruence between who we know ourselves to be and how we are seen and held in society. Again, due to copyright concerns, this video is embedded for you to review via the free Building Belonging slide deck and resource sheet, and it's meant to be used in conversation with the rest of the shared material here. So please feel free to view this video at a self-guided pace. The conversation on the next slide is going to be a synthesized version of this content that you can view at your own pace. So when we talk about gender identity, one of the things that's incredibly important for us to understand is that it is comprised of so much more than what we see on our birth certificate or our government IDs. And so thinking about sex at birth, this is the process in which an infant at birth is checked over for external physical characteristics which fall between the constructed binary of boy or girl. Body-based characteristics are those that change over time and graduate or mature as we age into adulthood through what we call puberty. And these include what kind of reproductive anatomy we have within the inside of our body, where we grow or cannot grow hair, what the level of hormones are in our body, and whether that is a mixture of testosterone and estrogen, and at what level we can create those. Additionally, other body-based characteristics are what our voice sounds like, where the curves of our body are, what our musculature is, and the degree of height we have or our stature. When we think about gender identity and its expression, these are things that are also very universal, meaning how we perform who we are to the world. So these are things that include our hair, what style of hair we use, what colors of hair we wear, the ways in which we go to a barber or a different kind of hair salon. Also makeup and hygiene and shaving, what places on our body we do shave and what places on our body we don't. Thinking about clothing, not only what department you may buy your clothing from, but what your clothing is supposed to represent about you and your identity. Also accessories, thinking about things like piercings, tattoos, glasses, the ways in which we decorate ourselves to give key information about how we feel the most aligned and how we feel the most powerful when we're being inspected by society. Additionally, in gender expression is speech, how a person is able to manipulate their voice or use certain words and language so that they are seen and can influence their environment more fully. And then we have the discussion about gender identity and what happens when there is incongruence. And so before we get to gender dysphoria, I thought that it would be an incredible time to talk about body dysmorphia as well. We know within our society that most people that are affected by disordered eating and symptoms of unhealthy eating patterns also can experience body dysmorphia. Body dysmorphia in and of itself is that kind of chronic feeling of never knowing what you look like, and looking at yourself or understanding your body itself being something that is painful. And so thinking about how there have probably been times in most people's life without some sort of diagnosis needed where we have seen ourselves as less than what we hope we can be. We live in a society where social media is abound with ways that we can stop aging and products that can make us more thin and beauty tips and tricks and hacks to be prettier or more masculine or fit into a standard more fully. And so thinking about how all of us have had some degree of incongruence, inalignment, or distress about our body and the reality of our body is a really good place for us to start before talking about gender dysphoria. So body dysmorphia is something that can occur and does occur within multiple communities of people and is a very real distress that is felt within the body and also the mind about what the body looks like, what the body should or should not look like, and the distress of feeling perceived in society as something different than you hope. Gender dysphoria is different. And gender dysphoria is this felt sense within the self that the body that you are inhabiting is incorrect, that the gender that has been provided to you, not only by the medical community, but also by your secondary sex characteristics, genitalia, and maybe even puberty at that point, do not align with who you know yourself to be. And so these are very important topics to talk about because the mitigation of body distress looks a lot like the ability to use expression, that hair, that makeup, the shaving, the clothes, the accessories, the speech, to modify or to mitigate that felt sense of not belonging within the body. This is an incredibly helpful diagram that was created by GLSEN and is in your reference material for this Building Belonging series. And what this really seeks to show is the interconnectedness of gender. And for the purpose of this, we'll be going through it starting with sex assigned at birth. Sex assigned at birth is what the medical community labels you. And this follows us through our life, not only on our birth certificate and our government issued IDs, but it starts the train on our social conditioning from birth. And so the possibilities at birth of how you can be assigned, how your sex can be assigned, are very minimal. We typically see that a male or female is the sex designation provided by the medical community when someone is born. In certain circumstances, when an infant is born, they can also be designated as intersex. meaning that their gender is ambiguous because their genitalia does not fall into the kind of socially constructed understanding of what male and female gender and sex should be. And we're going to talk more about that experience of intersex and how complicated it is to make a person fall into the categories of solely male and female. But for this particular slide, what's important is that this is the label that the medical community gives you. And then throughout your life, you are either affirmed or feel conflict with the ways in which that medical designation is provided. So thinking about things like the conversations that people have about what toys are for boys and what toys are for girls, what behavior is ladylike and what behavior isn't acceptable for boys, like crying or painting their nails, right? Thinking about how our society has kind of gendered characteristics, expressions of feelings, toys for marketing, and even separating children as young as pre-K and kindergarten into boys' lines and girls' lines to go to the bus or to the bathroom. Our society socially is incredibly gendered, and because of that, we understand that people who do not feel a congruence with their sex assigned at birth feel this way socially quite often. So besides the sex assigned at birth category, the next one that we're going to cover is gender attribution. And gender attribution is how your gender is perceived by others. So thinking about the typical standard of men and masculinity and the socially acceptable standard of what is woman and what is femininity, and how well you as a person fit into that box, and in what ways you don't. So thinking about this idea that gender attribution is something that gives you a space of belonging if your body uniquely does it well, or gives you a sense of isolation if your body deviates in any way from the classic or socially conditioned understanding of what gender is. So speaking or thinking about women who have polycystic ovarian syndrome, who have to shave or maybe don't shave, but are able to grow a full face of hair, and how this is perceived as a gender failure, right, socially, to not only be able to grow hair, but then also have to figure out ways to get rid of it. Thinking about things like men who are short or have high-pitched voices and what that means for their credibility in masculinity and manness. So gender attributions, even within people who align with the gender on their birth certificate, are still subject to social scrutiny. And this is where I think that the medical industrial complex and Western beauty standards have been able to really take us down as a society and continue to promote anti-aging and anti-fatness and things that can fix everything for a low payment of $99.99 a month, right? So attributions that are just organic and biological to who you are as a person, being things that people can judge or rate, that help you fall into or show that you do not belong in that male or female gender binary that we've created. Now, gender expression on the right-hand side is different. It's in response to sex assigned at birth and gender attribution. But gender expression is where we all get to play and have permission and freedom to display our gender, to perform our gender the ways in which we understand it. And so this is done by clothing and makeup and hairstyles and growing specific types of facial hair, and whether we work out and have a ton of muscle or we're incredibly lean and fall into a thin category. This is where tattoos and piercings and adorning your body with watches and necklaces and all of these kinds of things. This is how we authenticate not only who we are, but it helps us to have a conversation visually with the rest of the world about how we feel, not only about our gender, but who we know ourselves to be. And this is an intimate conversation that I think evolves throughout the lifetime and should be celebrated as a way to feel empowered, a way to respond to the social pressures of beauty and gender belonging. Lastly, we have gender identity, which is in the middle of this triangle, and the brain is there because gender identity itself is an internal understanding. And what I mean by that is that this is where either you feel an incredible sense of congruence with what your driver's license or your birth certificate says, whether it says male, female, or intersex, or whether there's a conflict or an incongruence, and you have a known sense that you do not fall into the categories in which you have been given. And so one of the most helpful ways to describe this to people is that if you feel a congruence with your birth certificate and your designation of male, female, or intersex, you would not understand the experience of gender diversity or transgender experience because it is not something that you think about when you wake up. It is not something that you think about when you get ready for your day. It is not a consideration of yours if you can authentically show up as who you are and be believed by society in such a way. And I do understand from multiple marginalized communities that this is a shared experience socially of hoping that there is an authenticity and a knowingness of society to uphold, whether that's a visible or invisible disability, whether this is a racialized conversation, whether this is a conversation about sanity and mental health or mental illness. But thinking just particularly about gender, what I want us to consider is that the known sense of being transgender or gender diverse is one that begins at the moment that you wake up and you know that the body in which you inhabit is one that in and of itself is creating distress, that you have a responsibility to either handle and manage and live secretly into, or affirm very publicly and risk the inherent social erasure or suspicion that can occur for some trans people. And so gender identity is who you know yourself to be, regardless of what the conversations socially and medically about your body have entailed, maybe throughout your entire life. This is another quick video that we've embedded for you on gender and sex as a spectrum, and it's been provided for self-guided viewing. And I want you to please note that we're using the most up-to-date science and medical models in an effort to demystify the identity-based concepts and harmful political rhetoric talking about gender being a binary that only includes two sexes of male and female, and the social conditions that apply to those two individual identities. So this video that's been provided is a long and complicated but illuminating look on how it's incredible, the making of a person, and how, because so many systems within the body and within the body of our birth parent must be in conversation during our development, that our diversity and uniqueness are not by accident, but these are statistical truths. And the hope for this series is to ensure that we continuously find ways to build belonging. And within a society so polarized by rhetoric regarding bodies, we hold faithful to the idea that our diversity in body is the only way to see the vastness of the image that is sacred and divine. So in conversation with what you have known about sex, gender, and sexuality this far, and hopefully with the self-guided video watching that you may have done already, it's our hope to now pair all of these things together and talk about how we know that these are social constructs and ideas, and how we also know that these terms being rigid and fixed and static through someone's life is a lie that needs to be demystified. So in regards to sex, gender, and sexuality, all of these innate orientations that we share universally, they're fluid and flexible and dynamic, and they exist on a spectrum, not two opposing binaries. Nothing about the idea of our body is an either or, it's always an and. And so movement in these categories changes through our life with experience, exposure, access to language about our identities, age and aging, illness and ability, puberty and menopause, whether we're partnered or we're single, whether we've experienced trauma or violence, if we're in a society that is beholden to bias and stigma about identities and behaviors, and whether we have social support or we lack social support. And so some of the things that I think are really important for us to discuss, right, are these ideas that even in the spectrum of sexuality that we discussed in the beginning of this training, that our libido, our sexual attraction, the rate that we are attracted to someone, whether we're repulsed by sex or we feel incredibly sex positive, all of that changes so vastly through our life. Thinking about our ideas of who we wanted to partner with when we were children and watching Disney movies versus what that felt like during puberty, or even into a marriage, what the relationship and the relationship to sex and intimacy was 6 months before marriage versus 1 year into marriage versus maybe 25 years into that same relationship. Also thinking about the fact that age and the process of aging changes how we look, how we feel about our body, how we feel about our ability to sexually relate, how we feel about beauty in and of itself. All of these are components that change and move and are in fluctuation as we age. Also thinking about illness and ability, and how sex and sexual orientation and sexual relating change if we are sick, if we have a chronic illness, if we are experiencing high levels of pain, if we lose the capacity to move or ambulate parts of our body, what this does in conversation with our ability to have sex. Also thinking about partnership and being single, and what changes in the function of our sexual orientation, whether we are partnered, whether we are dating, whether we're dating multiple people, or we are single. And also the experience of trauma and violence and how it changes maybe our ability to trust, our ability to be vulnerable, our ability to experience sex positivity and sex as pleasure. And then bias, stigma, and a lack of social support. These are in direct conversation maybe with the choices that we make of partnership, or whether or not to talk about our questioning of gender and where we fall within that socially constructed binary of male and female. And so I want to open up those conversations about what truly is possible and the ways in which these are constantly renegotiated throughout the lifetime of a person, regardless of whether you are LGBTQ or you are straight and you've been in a long-term partnership for 5 decades now. Another really important thing to kind of see is a person come alive through these ideas and how these concepts and roles and identities can fluctuate. And so over on the right-hand side of this slide is a little flowchart into at least my experience as a facilitator when it comes to sex, gender, and sexuality. And so here is my own kind of inner workings of these identities and what I know to be true for myself and what I know to be true of my experience currently when it relates to gender and sex and also sexual orientation. And so thinking about myself, I am a facilitator coming to you from a place that does designate gender and sex on a birth certificate, and my birth certificate says female. However, when we think about gender expression, which is very different than gender and sex itself, my expression of my own body leans into a more masculine presentation than it does a feminine. And so thinking about how even in our school systems and in the ways that we talk to each other about gender and whether we fall in line with it, I have always kind of been seen as a tomboy or someone who does not hold up a highly feminine social construct in the way that I dress, in the way that I perform my gender to the world. I identify as someone who is genderqueer or gender diverse, meaning that I do not feel as if I am a person who is only female, but I also do not feel as if I am completely beholden to the identity as a transgender person. I do not believe that I feel like I am a male either. As far as sexual orientation goes, on this kind of spectrum of straight or gay, I fall very queer adjacent. That's farther on the right-hand side. I do not typically experience an attraction to or a persistent, attraction, not only just an attraction, but like a practice of sex with people who are male. And so thinking about how that changes my understanding of the world and just sex in general and who I find attractive. On the scale of how often sexual, attraction occurs for me, I am kind of somewhere in the middle. I don't necessarily feel high levels of attraction to people, but I do feel them. And so I do not categorize myself as asexual either. Thinking about the affectional versus aromantic, I consider myself very affectionate, very romantic, very intimate. I think that does not have to be confined to just sexual relationships, but those kind of span all of my relationships. I tend to express my love languages through touch and time and acts of service, and those aren't restricted to just my sexual and romantic relationships, but truly through all of the relationships that I have in life. Libido is one that has changed a lot through my life as a person who has some chronic illness, as a person who has some trauma in my history. This is one that can move. It moves during pregnancy, it moves during puberty, it moves while you age and experience things like perimenopause or menopause if you're a person who has a vulva. Sex positivity. I am a person who experiences high levels of sex positivity and sex favorability. And I think those are things that have changed throughout my life as a person who's understood that guilt and shame are kind of symptoms of not kind of fitting into the social constructs and the social rules about who people are allowed to have sex with, about what behaviors and what attractions are appropriate. And so the work of becoming sex positive, the work of experiencing sex as favorable, has been one that doesn't only include my own body and my own understanding of attraction, but also includes theological conversations and social conversations about whose right it is to tell people what their sexual behavior means for them. And potentially maybe even in some of those conversations, what that means for their salvation. Cole Arthur Riley, in her book Black Liturgies, says, "We are worthy of a particular belonging that does not demand uniformity, but understands and honors our stunning particularity." In our Building Belonging series, we continue to create spaces for felt and practiced solidarity. Gender affirmation is a unique and highly individual process, but it's not solely used by people who are transgender or gender diverse. In fact, this section is going to explore the ways in which all gender affirming care was created for cisgender people, people who feel an alignment with what the medical community designated them at birth, and how those social constructs and social conditioning applied to all of us beginning at birth and has not been neutral to anyone. So, what does it mean to understand gender affirmation as solidarity? Let's talk for a moment about the cost of our socially constructed ideas of what is feminine and what is masculine, what is male, what is female, and what that means for all of us who are hoping to fully belong in society. So thinking about the ideas of gender reveals and the bus line, right? Thinking about how as an infant is being born, one of the most important questions that is being asked right after is it a boy or a girl? When fully well we know, as either the birthing parent or the family of this infant, that this is not what is going to be front and center for most of the formation of our relationship with this child. But as the medical community does, it designates this male or female designation on a birth certificate, and then begins this long and arduous conditioning of an infant, and then a toddler, and then a kindergartner, and then a school-age child, and then as a pubescent child, into what we believe are the social norms for boyness and girlness. What I know, and I have come to know as my work as a mental health practitioner and as a theologian, is that there is a lot of harm done by carrying around these social scripts and hoping that they will all work for everyone. We know for a fact that our kids, regardless of whether they feel gender dysphoria, understand themselves to be trans, or are simply kids who are cisgender, meaning that their birth certificate and their gender identity align, is that these concepts of boyness and girlness, what is masculine and what is feminine, are harmful to us all because they've created these non-changing, very static, and super demanding archetypes of us all that are not only impossible to meet, but leave us with a sense of not belonging and a sense of not being good enough most of the time. One of the biggest conversations in politics over the course of the last decade for the LGBTQ community is where people are allowed to go to the bathroom. And one of the things that my research has discovered is that peeing in public has always been political, but it wasn't the case as much socially within the United States of America before World War II. So peeing in public before World War II meant going into a bathroom that wasn't gendered at all. Peeing in public before World War II meant going into a place that had a latrine and going into a place that had a toilet. Everyone shared this designated place that just meant that you had to use the bathroom. What changed after World War II was that our society, that had really been founded on the Eurocentric principles and the Christian perspective of where women's places were, which was the home, began to be troubled by the fact that women were necessary within World War II in industry, in commerce, in the workplace, and within the social life in different ways. And so because after World War II, women's place was no longer within the kitchen, but also included the social arena, there needed to be this clear designation of othering. And one of the ways in which that happened was that bathrooms became political and became objects of power. And so bathrooms before World War II were gender neutral and very much like the porta potties that you will see at a concert. If you had to go, you knew exactly where to go for your business, and it didn't really matter who was there before or after you. The ugly truth about Western beauty standards is this. There is a subscription that you can pay, a treatment that you can buy. There are multiple different skincare routines and diets and fads and trends that we can stay up on to stay in touch with the social rules of beauty for our time. The ugly truth about that is that these have never made our human uniqueness into a celebration. And so when we think about Western beauty standards, what is important for us to understand is that for anyone who has been a marginalized member of a community, Western beauty standards have always felt like abject failure. And so if we think about the fact that the makeup industry, the beauty industry, the culture of skincare, right, within our society, really only speaks to middle class or upper class white women, we begin to understand that beauty as the concept that we have designated within our society really fails short to celebrate most people's uniqueness. Meaning that for trans folks who want to be seen and valued and believed as who they know themselves to be, there's this arduous climb that needs to be faced or replaced with some sort of resistance about what beauty can look like and what it needs to look like for safety. Thinking about fitness and fatness and pretty privilege is also another place where we can understand the experiences of trans and queer and gender diverse people more fully. Thinking about the fact that most people's bodies are a moral failing if they happen to be disabled, or they are not strong, or they are not thin, or they do not meet our socially defined rules of facial symmetry and perfection, right? So when we talk about the passing privilege of trans people or the ways that they are supposed to fit in to society, what we're really talking about is the hope that they will fall in line with standards that even most of us who are white, who are monetarily and financially privileged, who have access to things that were made for us, still feel like we're failing at. And so thinking about how these have all been designated roles, designated rules, and designated social constructs that even the people with the most access feel as if they are not doing well enough, shows us a moment where we can create solidarity for people who currently do not, or maybe will never, be able to fit into these socially constructed, completely irreversible ideas of who gets to belong and who is credible and meaningful in society. Lastly, when we talk about affirming solidarity, it's important to talk about gender affirming care. And the most widely discussed and political conversation about hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. One of the most telling conversations about trans people that is happening currently is about whether or not they should have access to hormone therapy. And because of the fact that these are new conversations that have a very polarizing and kind of fear-based approach to them, what a lot of people don't know is that hormone therapy began in the 1910s and 1920s for men who were cisgender and straight and white, who were experiencing low sex drive, low libido, and muscle loss in their late 20s, early 30s, and into their 40s. Hormone therapy itself was created for men and women to perform gender more easily, with less distress, and with better outcomes for their sex lives and their own bodies. And so hormone therapy in and of itself is something that was always accessible to the people it was created by and for. But now that the conversation about gender affirmation includes transgender people and gender diverse people, there is this competing idea, right, that the gender binary should be the way in which we measure a person's ability to be who they are socially. And so I think it's important for us to all acknowledge that hormone therapy, that westernized beauty standards, that ability and fat phobia and pretty privilege and these discussions about bathrooms, right? They're not new. And there are ways in which, if we understand at the heart where these social constructs came from, which were at the foundation and at the colonization of the United States in the early 1900s, we'll understand that these were always social constructs that were meant to exclude someone. And they are these unreachable ideas that are harming everyone at their core. I want to now share what's at stake. When we think about gender and we think about sexual orientation, and maybe we're having these conversations with building a belonging in a way where we're thinking about them differently. it's important for us to know what it's like to be living as a person who is LGBTQ right now. What we know as far as the current statistics are concerned is that 9% of the population identifies as LGBTQIA, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual. 70% of transgender and gender nonconforming people have feared for their safety. 3 out of 10 transgender or gender nonconforming people have an accepting social network. So 30% of people who are trans and gender nonconforming have social support. 50% of LGBTQIA people have avoided faith spaces because they have experienced harassment or exclusion from a faith space prior. 12% of LGBTQ youth under 20 have attempted suicide in the year 2024. 46% of trans and gender nonconforming youth considered suicide in 2024. 49% of LGBTQIA youth report serious bullying or harassment within schools or families. And 90% of LGBTQIA youth have experienced anxiety and depression due to the current political climate in the years of 2024 and 2025. When Building a Belonging talks about the theological and social imperative to inspire inclusion, these are the kinds of statistics and high-stakes conversations that we hope that you will consider. We want to talk now about queer theology and why queer theology is for all of us. Cassidy Hall, in her book Queering Contemplation, says, "Queer is how I tilt my head to look at the world." At the center of queer theology, what we mean is a theology that is embodied, it is whole, it represents and centers the other, it seeks to find the power and the powerless, it centers the power of the powerless, and demands an interrogation of the gain from the power exchange taking place. The focus of queer theology is for us to re-narrate the story back to its fullness by reauthoring the autonomy of marginalized people. And the practice of queer theology is to find the other, to find the power, to find the motive, and to invert the story. Say the story through the voice of the other. There have been many theological tools of oppression that have been designed over the course of human existence. But the oppressive social constructs of 2025 that we hope to name and have conversation about in these Building Belonging series are poverty and social class, race with the invention of whiteness in 1619, gender, which was invented and language provided for it in the 20th century, Western beauty standards, disability, sanity, political parties, and conservative religion. Each of these social constructs that have just been named have a root in colonial and empirical Christianity as a practice that spans from the Constantinian Empire and beyond. But one very important fact is that those did not come from the canonized Bible, in which Christianity gives and receives its inspiration. What oppressive theology seeks to do is multifold. And for this belonging series that we've created, we are going to continue to talk about the nimble and dynamic ways that oppressive theology has worked throughout human existence. One of the most important things that oppressive theology has done is it's created a consensus reality for us. Think about sitting late night watching a home shopping network where 90% of people loved this particular new cooking device. What they don't tell you is that it may have been 10 people, and they may have paid those people to give them some sort of review of this device. Consensus reality is this created normalcy of everybody's doing it, or nobody feels that way, or the modern average person, XYZ. We should be careful about digesting and holding consensus reality facts and consensus reality behaviors as the truth of the whole. So thinking about a consensus reality that has been created for us over time, thinking about how the Constantinian Empire and capitalism are now a lasting legacy for the ways in which we understand society. Thinking about those early mission trips of go forth and conquer being the ones where we spread the word of God, but also the plague of the colonial empire. How slave Bibles became those where all of the stories of Exodus and reclamation were erased, and how homosexuality was then added back into such Bibles as a typo that changed everything for those in the queer community. Oppressive theology also determines who has access to being known. Diasporic communities who are seen as lower caste or lower class, who is a saint, who is a sinner, whose suffering will end in salvation, and whose will end in soul death. Oppressive theology also creates systems of silence, thinking about these places that people who were intolerable or didn't quite fit into the world were placed where weeping and the gnashing of teeth, or hell and rapture, or cancel culture were clear consequences of not falling in line. Lastly, oppressive theology embeds implicit stories into us. Some of the most common are that we were good, that we are inherent disappointments, and that individual work on the self is the only way to reach heaven. So what are theological tools of belonging? In our Building Belonging series, we've defined how social and theological and spiritual and existential belonging feel. And so when we talk about using those as tools of belonging theologically, it is that understanding of being known, understanding of being whole, understanding of your diversity being necessary, that is at the heart of true belonging. So theological tools of belonging resist socially constructed truths. Consensus reality then means it could be a lie. Normal and the idea of normal has been created. That badness isn't a litmus in most conversations, and that fear is never and has never been the same as danger. Theological tools of belonging affirm the sacred within all people, that God says it was good, that we were born good, that we were born to belong, and that we are all necessary in this moment of experience. Theological tools of belonging elevate stories of harm and misuse. The whole of religions have harmed, and the whole of religion and society has benefited from that harm. Telling the true story is the first step in accountability. Theological tools of belonging also reconcile the harm and posture humbly through the retelling of the stories, the reclamation of the liturgy, and the resistance to stagnation due to fear. Lynn Marie Tunstad in Queer Theology Beyond Apologetics says, the whole social order that separates people into the decent and indecent, that regulates accepted orders of bodily and economic exchange, is ruptured by a Christ who gave his life for all, but most particularly the despised. A Christ who died at the hands of a colonial empire. Thank you for tuning in to our Building Belonging series on sexual orientation, gender, and identity, a theological and scientific primer. What you'll see listed before you on this last slide are the PowerPoint resources and continued sources of information that we will hopefully see you engaging with. Take a moment after this presentation is over to complete our post survey and review the videos if you have not already in the self-directed slides that we have provided.